recording because
That is
it's a
perfect.
little complicated. Okay, the recording is on. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mary Kells. And now I'm going to say about something important. I think it's a topic that's worth addressing. So what type of support do professionals need? Because it's important. Sometimes as therapists, we forget that therapists also need support. That's why I would like to encourage you to listen to our next speaker, and I'm going to give the floor to Mary now, please.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Magdalena, for your introduction, and thank you to yourself and to the committee for the invitation to speak here this evening. So delighted to be with you all virtually and to have the opportunity to share some information about Clinician Connections with you all. So great also to see some familiar faces and also to recognise some familiar names from our trip to Gdansk a couple of years ago when we first spoke to you about family connections. So before I get into Clinician Connections, first of all, I really want to thank Alan Fruzzetti and the late Fruzzetti Hoffman for both being so generous in giving us permission to adapt materials from Family Connections to develop Clinician Connections. This has really been invaluable. And also to acknowledge Daniel Flynn, who we have been listening to over the last hour. So Daniel and I have been jointly working on a program called Clinician Connections roughly over the past 4 years. So just a quick overview of what I'm hoping to speak to you all about this evening. I guess, first of all, I really want to talk about why we really think that systems interventions matter. And I know in many ways here I'm preaching to the converted, that you all believe in systems interventions. But in particular, I'd like to focus on why we think systems interventions for all of our frontline staff are particularly important. And then why it is that we felt that family connections was something which could easily be adapted for our clinicians. Then what I want to focus on is some detail of the structure and an overview of the content from the actual Clinician Connections program. And then I'd like to move along to speak a little bit about our preliminary research and current research which is underway at the moment. So in terms of structuring the environment, I guess if we start by thinking about the person with borderline personality disorder or severe emotion dysregulation, we all know that there's a huge amount of pain and suffering associated with this presentation. And for that reason, I think we'll all agree that evidence-based interventions, such as dialectical behaviour therapy, are an absolute priority for this client group. And thankfully, we know that standard DBT, when implemented with all of its modalities, consistently achieves really good outcomes for clients with this presentation. So that's fantastic. But as you know, individuals exist within systems, and it makes a whole lot of sense for us to target interventions at systems and particularly at family systems. And we know that when we do this, there's potentially benefits for the individual with borderline personality disorder, benefits for the family member, and also potentially huge benefits for the relationship. So we know that when we can offer a family intervention, so there's huge potential for us optimizing the relationship and for all parties becoming a lot more skilled. So when we first started to offer DBT back in Cork in Ireland in 2010, really within a couple of weeks of starting to offer a program, we started to really see the need for a parallel systems intervention or a family program. And at that time, we were very fortunate to come across Family Connections, which, as we all know, was developed by Perry and Alan. And as you know, it's a multi-family intervention, and it's broken down into 6 modules, and you can see the overview of these modules. I know you've seen this earlier on this evening as well, and that many of you are familiar with that also. And I guess because Family Connections has a growing evidence base and has consistently demonstrated really positive outcomes for participants, we were particularly interested in offering this intervention and started to do so as a standard part of our service. And I guess for a number of years then, we offered our standard DBT programs. We consistently offered family connections as well and got really good outcomes locally in Ireland. But I guess we started to think over a number of years, really over the past 5 years or so, about the need which we saw to offer additional systems interventions, and in particular, the need to offer systems interventions with all of our frontline staff. I guess when we think about how our health service is organised, a very small number of practitioners will be trained in evidence-based treatments such as dialectical behaviour therapy. But in the course of the individual with BPD's engagement with all of our health services, typically they will come into contact with many, many professionals who are highly trained within their own right, but just don't happen to have any information about borderline personality disorder. So often these individuals will maybe work in general health in the emergency department. They might work in acute medical units. They might work in acute mental health units, or maybe in crisis teams. And anecdotally, what a lot of our colleagues who worked in these types of settings were saying to us is, we really need training and support. We don't feel like we have a systematic way of working whereby we feel that we're actually being effective. We find the work difficult. It's actually really hard for us to know if we're contributing in any kind of a meaningful way. Then I guess what we did was we looked at the research in the area, and actually the research which has been carried out with health professionals who don't have specific training in a model which is evidence-based for working with BPD, I guess those findings seem to be very consistent with the anecdotal information which our colleagues shared with us. Research finds that a lot of staff who work in emergency departments and acute mental health units really don't feel that they have adequate training and support to work effectively with people with BPD. And unfortunately, we came across a considerable amount of research which I guess demonstrates kind of similar findings to what Alan mentioned earlier on about staff being judgmental and not understanding clients with BPD. We found in that research, people talked about having negative attitudes towards people with BPD, viewing self-harm as being maybe manipulative and attention-seeking, and I guess struggling to maintain empathy over time. And these research findings are really difficult to hear about. And I think, we had all hoped that those types of views were historical, but unfortunately, some of that research was published in relatively recent years. And I know it would be tempting for all of us to get judgmental of the people who were judgmental of those with BPD, but ultimately that wouldn't be effective. So what we're going to try and do is, I guess, understand a little bit more about, why that is. And I guess Alan summarized that quite well: fear and lack of understanding, and then to think a little bit more about interventions. And I think when we think about polarities which exist in systems, and when we think about staff who in some capacity find themselves working with people with BPD without specific training in BPD, I think it's understandable that staff would find themselves in rather polarized positions or at the extremes of the dialectic and really struggling to get to any kind of synthesis or any kind of middle ground. But while this is understandable at a human level, for staff to spend a lot of time in these polarized positions really does not set services up to be effective in any way. So I guess, as I mentioned, it's difficult to hear about this research where staff are being judgmental and pejorative towards our clients, and it will be easy for us to get judgmental. But if we kind of hold on to our assumption that people are doing the best that they can, and also if we think about the very many reasons why it is that staff can find it difficult to be consistently skillful. I think first of all, if we think about severe distress and disorder, and if we think about an individual's presentation, maybe when they're in the middle of an episode of severe dysregulation, and how at that point the individual is maybe so dysregulated that it's really difficult for them to engage or to collaborate with a staff member, but that equally that's really difficult for the staff member who doesn't have specific training. Then I guess if we think about these next few points and what we know about emotion dysregulation, and if we think about an individual who is dysregulated and how it's understandable that they would then at that point be quite judgmental and maybe direct some of those judgments towards professionals, also express anger and maybe express some of that anger towards professionals, and also engage in inaccurate expression, which may sometimes be personally hurtful to our staff members. So I think if we consider all of these points, we can understand a little bit more how it's difficult for staff without training to be skillful. Then I guess thinking about how difficult it is to work effectively when you don't have any model for understanding what exactly emotion dysregulation is. Also thinking about staff maybe working in emergency departments and meeting somebody who's very dysregulated and meeting them for the first time and not having a sense of that person, of their lived history and of their lived experience, that can be difficult. And typically our frontline staff aren't trained in conflict resolution, and we know as DBT therapists that it's really helpful if we can practice acceptance skills, but often our colleagues who work in the front line in any capacity don't have specific training in these types of skills. Then I guess if we think about what happens to all of us as human beings, staff included, and when we have heightened emotional arousal and we get judgmental and start to think about things in a binary way, at that point, it's understandable that a system might get polarized and think, actually, we're doing our best, you must not be trying, you are the problem. We know that that is hugely problematic, but in terms of what we know about human emotion, I guess it's understandable that people will get to that point. So when we then started to think about, well, what could a good intervention for our clinicians and our frontline staff actually be? And we started to think about, well, how could we adapt the Family Connections content to make it applicable to the support system outside of the family? Again, we looked at the results from Family Connections, the consistently positive outcomes, and I guess we thought it was fairly practical and reasonable to assume that the principles, skills, and concepts from Family Connections could be applied to the broader treatment system and to our clinicians. And then specifically, when we started to think about skills and what exact skills did we think that will be helpful for frontline staff in working with emotionally dysregulated clients? And essentially what came to mind in our discussions was a lot of the Family Connection skills. And then when we started to think about models, and we were thinking about how Family Connections is based on DBT and also stress and coping theory, and really both of those models seem to fit perfectly for an intervention with our frontline staff. Then I guess we started to think a little bit about some of the dialectical tensions which some of our staff may face. We thought about how when working with a client who's in the middle of an episode of emotion dysregulation and engaging in inaccurate expression, which may be judgmental of a staff member or personally hurtful to that staff member, that it might be understandable that the staff member would experience an emotional response, which if they were to express it, might clash with expectations professionally of that health service worker, and how the clinician might then have to balance that urge to express emotion in the moment with the duty and the responsibility to act professionally and to carry out their role. So we consider those dialectics quite a bit. Then in terms of how we actually adapted family connections to clinician connections. You can see a breakdown here on the screen. And I guess, first of all, in an ideal world, we would really like to have had a parallel module in clinician connections for each of the modules in family connections. But unfortunately, feasibility was a difficulty here, and we really needed to think quite practically in terms of how long of an intervention were our frontline staff going to be available for. So I guess we also held in mind that our frontline staff did have a baseline knowledge in mental health. So when we held in mind, I guess, the limited time that staff had available for training, along with their baseline knowledge of mental health, we thought it seemed pretty reasonable to condense some of the modules. So instead of Family Connections, as you know, involves 12 sessions, each of which are 2 hours long, we offered one 7-hour training, which I understand is condensed quite a bit. So what we essentially did with the materials and concepts from each module was we adapted them from the treatment system or from the family system and then applied them to the treatment system. And in terms of the actual breakdown of the modules, the first module, which you see here, Understanding Emotion Dysregulation, really encompasses concepts from modules 1 and 2 of Family Connections. Then we retained modules 3, 5, and 6 and the main concepts from those. And we omitted module 4, which is family environment skills. So we felt that if we needed to take something out, that was maybe something we could take out because we weren't working with families. Then in terms of our goals, we adapted these exactly from Family Connections, just applied to a different target group, our clinicians. So we aim to provide up-to-date and accurate psychoeducation about borderline personality disorder and emotion dysregulation. We aimed to teach some mini DBT skills. And thirdly, we aimed to cover a peer support function or to start the process of setting up peer support amongst colleagues. Again, we were realistic in terms of how much of setting up this peer support that we could do in a 7-hour course, but we considered that it was really important to start the conversations about the importance of peer support and to support people in thinking about how this could be done in their service. Then our assumptions from Clinician Connections, we have taken these exactly from DBT and from Family Connections, and we feel they're very relevant to all frontline staff working with people with BPD. So again, helping people think about a dialectical worldview and helping people think about how there's no absolute truth and that how all of us in certain situations where can start to believe we're right, can start to get quite polarized and can start to think that there isn't any other truth or any other information, and that typically isn't an effective place for us to be. We talk with our clinicians about how it's helpful to assume that all clients and clinicians are doing the best that we can, but at the same time, we can all do better, try harder. And we also talk to people about how benign interpretations are legitimate and effective, and talk to people about how in situations where we have heightened emotional arousal and those judgments start to flow for all of us, that sometimes we can have the tendency to go with more toxic interpretations which aren't helpful. And that working together, or at least in synchrony, is going to be more effective than not. Then there's a really lovely section at the start of Family Connections. It's called The Rights of Relatives, and usually when we deliver our Family Connections program, that's a take home and people report finding it really, really helpful. So we adapted this to, and we called it Clinician Needs, and retained the same concepts. So we talk about the need to balance work demands and self-care. And I think in theory, this is something which every clinician knows to be true, but that it's important to keep it on the agenda because when we're all busy, it can kind of slip off our radar. Then we talk about how we need to learn to acknowledge when our coping resources are challenged And we talk with clinicians about how in certain work environments, it can be difficult to acknowledge this, but that if we can acknowledge when our coping resources are challenged, we are then in a much better position to get the supports that we need and to stay well and to be effective in the longer term. And we talk about with clinicians how we need to accept that we will all get frustrated at times, that this is just part of being human and part of the human condition. And also that we need to accept that we cannot solve all of the other person's problems. In general, people work in healthcare because they want to support people in achieving a full recovery and in doing really well. And it can be really painful for staff members to be in a situation where the clients that they are working with aren't achieving the outcomes and recovery that we would all hope for them. And also that we need to have our own emotional support network. And I think starting the conversation about this is really important for our frontline colleagues who maybe don't have designated supervision time or don't historically have a culture of taking time out or taking time in their role to emotionally support each other, cultures where things are more task focused. So then in terms of a little bit of information about the content of the actual modules. So the first module focuses on helping people to understand what emotion dysregulation actually is. So we talk a lot about the transactional model, and we do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, we do it to help people understand how borderline personality disorder can develop over time between a back and forth transaction between an individual and an invalidating environment. And again, of course, we explain that this model hasn't been tested, but that this is our best guess at this point in time. But the other reason that we talk about the transactional model and the role of invalidation is so that we can all step back from our treatment systems and think about how actually, without any of us intending it to be, that sometimes certain things in the treatment system can be invalidating of our clients and can contribute to the client becoming even more dysregulated. So we think it's really important that we can have this discussion. Then we spend quite a bit of time considering what the experience of emotion dysregulation typically involves for our clients with borderline personality disorder, because often our frontline clinicians who don't have specific training in this model or in any model will say to us that they just find it so difficult to understand why people present with the types of dysregulated behaviours that they do. So we talk about what it means to experience heightened emotional arousal, and then how when we have heightened emotional arousal, judgments will flow and emotional arousal will become even higher, and that this can go round and round and can very quickly become a really painful place for all of our clients and can take them to a place of dysregulation where they're not fully in control of how they express their emotions or of their behavior, and how they can't focus on their long-term goals, aren't capable of complexity, and can say and do things which don't reflect what that person would say or do when they're well regulated, and support our staff in this way in understanding what inaccurate expression actually is and how this is difficult for the clinician, but it's understandable in light of the client experience. Then we get our staff to kind of think about recent times when they've been working with clients, when clients have likely gone through this cycle of dysregulation. But then we also spend some time in the module thinking about what is it like to be the staff member working with the client and to be part of this transaction. And we talk about how it's entirely normal for the clinician's experience of this situation to be influenced by their own vulnerabilities or their own emotional vulnerabilities on a particular day. And also how if the inaccurate expression which the client is engaging in is maybe personally insulting or hurtful to the clinician, that it's understandable that they would experience heightened emotional arousal. And it's also understandable that their minds would generate some judgments. And we talk to people about how we don't want to pathologize judgments, that we will all make judgments, but we want to support our clinicians in recognizing their own judgments and thereby supporting them to develop a non-judgmental stance, which we come to later. We also talk with our clinicians about how validation can be really, really tricky when somebody is engaging in lots and lots of inaccurate expression. So we try to validate how difficult this is for our frontline staff, because when somebody is engaging in inaccurate expression, we need to do a lot of guesswork. So as you know, we can't see what somebody is thinking. We cannot see what they are feeling. So it can be really, really difficult, and we can end up unintentionally invalidating somebody. And also at times, as you know, somebody can engage in inaccurate expression that is maybe dangerous or requires some intervention or is so inaccurate that needs to be corrected, but that the client will likely perceive this as invalidating and become even more dysregulated. So then in our second module, we focus on mindfulness skills, and we also focus on emotional awareness of self and others. So we do this from two perspectives. So when we start to talk about mindfulness skills, we first have conversations about what it might be like or how difficult it might be for our clients with emotion dysregulation to apply some of these mindfulness skills and how some of these skills may be useful for them. But a really significant focus of this module is supporting our staff in thinking about, well, how can they apply these skills to their own experiences in the workplace? And then similarly, we move along to talking about emotional awareness, and we draw on concepts from DBT and family connections and support staff in thinking about, well, what was your client likely experiencing in that situation? How difficult might that have been for them to manage the emotion? But then the other perspective we take is supporting staff in thinking about what emotion were they experiencing in the clinical situation and how can they effectively manage it. So when we start to talk with staff about understanding the impact of emotions, we have a conversation about, well, how do our emotions impact upon work? And we talk about how it's not possible to work in healthcare and to work with people who are emotionally dysregulated and not experience any emotion. We normalize the experience of sadness and anger when maybe we hear about some of the really awful things that our clients have experienced in their lives. We also talk about how it's really normal to feel anxiety if you're doing a tricky risk assessment and you're worried about a particular client and you're wondering if they're going to be safe, that it's normal to feel anxiety. And then we talk about, well, how do we understand our own emotional processing? And usually when we have this conversation, we hear from clinicians that in their workplace, usually there isn't really space to think about this. And then we need to think about how can we support them in having this space or in developing this space. And then we think about, well, how can we influence our own emotional state and then maybe the emotional state of others? So we introduced the possibility of maybe by staff implementing and practicing mindfulness skills and some emotional awareness skills, that this can allow them to become more effective in their interventions with clients. So this is one of the slides which we use on the training, and you can see here that the dog is really mindful. He is observing things exactly as they are. But for the person here, who we will assume is a busy clinician, things aren't so straightforward, and there's a lot of thinking, a lot of interpretation, and things aren't particularly well ordered. But the point we really want to make with our staff here is how the dog is under a lot less pressure. So all of our clinicians who come to this course are really busy staff members. They're under a lot of pressure, often a lot of pressure to multitask. Often they're short-staffed, working with limited resources and really long waiting lists. So what we want to balance is encouraging staff to use mindfulness skills and be effective as much as they can, but we don't want to invalidate them and the reality of how busy they are with their jobs. Then, as I mentioned, we teach the mindfulness skills to our colleagues as we do in DBT. We teach them the what skills, the how skills, and we talk about wise mind, and we support staff in working with examples and thinking about how they could practically practice these skills in their work lives, but also in their personal lives. And absolutely, if we are not mindful of our own thoughts, emotions, and body sensations, it's really difficult to respond effectively in relationships with others. And in focusing people in terms of how to practice relationship mindfulness, we talk people in the course through these 4 steps. That first of all, if they can observe and describe the client in front of them, notice their judgments and let go of the judgments. If they can really focus on staying exactly with the facts, minimize their interpretations by drawing on their wise mind, and then if they must make interpretations, to ensure that they're making very benign interpretations and ideally letting go of all interpretations. Then when we teach about primary and secondary emotions, some clinicians at the course will already be familiar with this distinction, and they will know that a primary emotion is an effective and adaptive response to an event in our environment, and that a secondary emotion is an emotion about an emotion. But some staff who will come to this course will not have heard about this distinction before. So regardless of whether people are familiar with this terminology, we try to take some time in the course to support people in thinking about recent interactions with clients who were dysregulated, and then thinking about what the client's likely secondary emotion might have been, but also thinking about what the primary emotions might have been, and then completing the exact same exercise in relation to their own emotional experience as they were engaged with this work. Then we talk people through the importance of trying to really reduce the cumulative impact of stress so that they can stay well in the longer term. We talk about reducing self-invalidation, but of course the first step here is first supporting people to become mindful of any self-invalidation they may be engaging in. Then to support them engaging in self-care, so the please skills from DBT and Family Connections, which you'll all be familiar with, which are so easy in theory, but I think we'll all agree, so difficult in practice. And then we talk about the importance of seeking support, be that peer support or supervision. And as I mentioned, this is particularly important for staff who don't have protected time as part of their job to engage in peer support or supervision, and to have conversations with them about how they can build that into their role or talk to their managers about getting it built in. And then we talk about how, when faced with tricky situations in work, it can be really tempting to avoid complexity, but that if we continue to avoid, that we will not build mastery. So we talk to people about the importance of avoiding and working with support and supervision to build mastery in implementing new skills. Then in our third module, which is validation and also an introduction to reciprocity. So we talk about what an invalidating environment is and isn't, and we do this for 2 reasons. So the first reason we do this is to ensure that none of our staff are making inaccurate interpretations about our clients' backgrounds or about our clients' families, because we all know from teaching Family Connections how damaging that can actually be. So we're really clear that it doesn't mean necessarily mean, cruel, abusive, neglectful, or uncaring, but it simply means that valid behaviours are sometimes missed. And the other reason we talk about this distinction is really to expand upon the point I mentioned earlier on about how we certainly don't want staff thinking that just because the treatment system isn't mean, cruel, or abusive, that it couldn't possibly be invalidating. So we want all staff to go away from the training thinking about, well, how could our treatment system, how could our service possibly be more validating of our clients? Because there's always going to be ways in which the service can improve in terms of validating clients. Then we help people to understand what exactly validation is. Again, being really clear about how validation means that we understand, and it doesn't mean that we have to agree with the behavior that a person is engaging in. We're essentially just actively communicating that the other person's perspective makes sense, and supporting staff in thinking about how even in the most difficult situations with lots of dysregulation and with really problematic behavior, there is always going to be something valid which can be found. So then we do some specific teaching with staff to support them in thinking about how they could look for something valid to validate. And we have some examples here on this slide. So the person's primary emotional responses is always going to be valid. We can always validate the task difficulty, the person's emotional pain, the person's reasons for feeling out of control, the person's ability to attain their ultimate goals. Then we introduce the idea of reciprocity and talk about how, as long as a person is working in a healthcare service, client well-being is always going to some extent, impact upon staff well-being and vice versa. And sometimes people will talk about how maybe they've made a decision that they're not going to allow any emotion in relation to their work, and that they're simply not going to allow it to impact upon them. And we talk about how this isn't really how emotions work, and how this could set people up for a situation where they start to avoid their emotions and cut off, and that this doesn't set people up to be effective staff members. We talk about how if we can instead engage with our emotions and be mindful of them, we stand a much better chance of managing them effectively at work. Then we talk about blame because, as we all know, and as Alan mentioned earlier, sometimes conversations about blame come up in health services and they're really not helpful. And I think anytime there's conversations about cause and effect, sometimes blame can find a way into the conversation. Now, when I talk about blame, I'm not talking about governance and accountability. Our services will always need to have clear governance and we'll need to be accountable for our work. But what I'm talking about is the more judgmental or pejorative narratives that can sometimes develop in services that are really not helpful for anyone. So what we can see here is a number of different ways that this blaming game can essentially play out. So if a client is saying to the clinician, it's your fault, but the clinician is saying, no, it's your fault, we have a situation where there's contempt, there's blaming each other. Then if we have a situation where the client is saying to the clinician, it's your fault, but the clinician says, yeah, it is our fault, we have suffering and we have blaming of the clinician, which isn't what we want. Then if the client says, no, it's all my fault, there's suffering and client blaming. And then we have, if the client says, no, it's my fault, and the clinician says, it's our fault, we see that everybody is suffering. And we really don't want this level of suffering for anybody. So instead, we talk with our clinicians on this course about how a more effective route to take is to step away from the conversation about blame and to accept pain and to work on managing it together. Then in our final module, we talk about problem management and acceptance skills, and we talk about different ways of defining and conceptualizing problems, different ways of approaching problems, and also different types of problem solving or strategies for problem management. And we're very clear about the difference between collaborative and unilateral problem solving, which is a point that many of you may be familiar with, also from Family Connections. And I guess in some respects, as DBT therapists, we're in a very privileged position because our client has signed up to working on agreed goals and targets with us, and they have essentially given us an invitation to treat. So that sets the stage quite well for collaborative problem solving in DBT. But many of our colleagues who work in emergency departments and acute mental health units are in a different situation, because often they will work with the person with emotion dysregulation at a point when they're quite unwell and really not ready to engage in any kind of collaborative work with the clinician. So from that point of view, us teaching about unilateral problem solving and strategies which clinicians could use to maybe help the client get closer to a place where they're able to engage in collaboration could be really helpful. And also to support clinicians in having strategies to make sure that they don't do anything to make things worse, no matter how bad things already are. Then a final concept we introduce is a really difficult one, but a really useful one. And we talk about radical acceptance and how this can be really useful for clinicians when they're working with emotionally dysregulated clients, and how, as you can see here, that it's not a one-stop shop, and really there is a cycle, so that it makes sense to feel sad, and it's a difficult reality to accept when things aren't how we would like them to be for our clients, but that if we can support the clinician to allow the sadness, coach them on how to validate themselves, coach them on how to set up peer support so that they can seek validation from others, that we hope that this will then put them in a really good position to get reactivated and to continue to be effective in their jobs. So when we first started doing this work, we were really interested in clinician perception. So we just wanted to know that what did clinicians think about this course. So we carried out a study on staff perception. So Lucy Burke, who was a doctoral student with us a few years ago, carried out 3 focus groups with 13 clinicians who had completed this course. And what I'd like to do now is to speak to you about the themes which emerged from this research. So you can see the themes there, and just an overview of them. And I'm not sure why this is stalled.
Sorry, Mary, your screen has stopped sharing, so the one that's
okay, I'm viewing somebody else's screen. Thank you, Daniel. So I will try and remedy that. Okay. Great. Can you all see my slides again now? Great. So I'm back to looking at the slides in English so I can understand them a little bit better again. So this is just an overview of the master themes and the sub-themes from that research, which I'd like to speak a little bit about. So the first theme which emerged from this research was the need for training. And so staff told us about the lack of knowledge which they felt they had about borderline personality disorder. And one person said that, you know, when you tell people to use their DBT skills, you're really just shooting in the dark. You're asking, but that you don't really know what you're asking the person to do, and that this is a difficult place for staff to be. Another sub-theme which emerged was feeling helpless. So somebody spoke about a sense of helplessness, getting swallowed up and almost becoming dysregulated yourself, which sounds like a really difficult place for a staff member to be. But another sub-theme which emerged was, how can I help? So there was a real interest in learning effective strategies and in learning about a model. People really wanted to do more to be effective and to help people who were dysregulated. Then the second theme which emerged was a new understanding after completing the course. And people talked about developing an understanding of emotion dysregulation and how this took away the impatience and the lack of empathy and allowed them to become more patient and increase their empathy. And people also became aware of the clinician impact in interactions. So you see some quotes here about how becoming more aware of oneself, being more mindful of things like one's facial expressions and a person's emotional vulnerability on a particular day allowed that person to become more effective in their interactions with clients. And thankfully, it also supported our staff in developing an alternative perspective. So as you can see from the quotes here, it allowed our staff to engage more willingly, more effectively, less judgmentally with our clients, which is great. Then the third theme was validation and really the impact of that validation module. So staff talked about how validation skills really supported them in just trying harder with the person who was dysregulated, and that validation was something which really stayed in their mind after the course was finished, and in particular that distinction about what validation actually is, and that you can really validate something about the person's experience without agreeing with their behaviour. And staff also talked about changing their goals really in that clinical interaction, stepping away from their fixed agenda or their protocol, and instead realising that actually the most important thing that happens here is that the client is heard. And validation also really allowed our staff to move forward in transactions. It essentially allowed them to become unstuck. There were also some barriers to applying new skills which emerged, and the theme of not knowing emerged, and it appeared that while people had new information, people still had some reservations and were afraid of doing the wrong thing or trying a new strategy or a different way of being with the client and maybe doing something that wasn't effective for the client. Then there were also some ideas which emerged in terms of overcoming barriers to skills applications. And one of the main ones which came up was further training, and people talked about how more practical skills and role plays would be helpful. And I guess this theme about further training makes a lot of sense when we think about what we know about learning any kind of new skills, that we need to go through the phase of skills acquisition, skills strengthening, and skills generalization. And I guess for us to be realistic about how much of that process can take place over a 7-hour training course. So maybe that's something that we can look into as we're refining and developing the content. Also, further communication emerged as a sub-theme, and there's feedback, as you can see here from the quotes, about our participants feeling that we kind of started the support function, but that people did need more support and guidance about getting up and running with ongoing peer support. So maybe this is something which we consider further also. And then finally, in terms of future directions for Clinician Connections, what emerged was staff spoke about a desire to obtain skills which could be applied in the moment when clients are in extreme distress. So it appears that after learning a little bit about some DBT skills and maybe applying them to their own situation, that people felt they'd like to actually learn in more detail about the practical application of these skills. And that also it gave them a little bit of knowledge about DBT concepts, but that after doing the training, some people felt that actually they would like to know a lot more. So in terms of our current phase of the research, so while it was really helpful to know about clinician perceptions, ultimately we have some research questions which we want to answer, and we're in the process of finishing our data collection. We essentially want to know if this program is effective and if mastery and self-efficacy levels increase following completion of this course, and also if symptoms of clinician burnout decrease following completion of this course. So at the moment, we are, as I mentioned, finishing our process of data collection. So in this phase of the study, we have invited clinicians to complete a battery of measures. So those include questionnaires on mastery, self-efficacy, and clinician burnout, and inviting the clinicians to fill those out just before they do the training. And then 1 month later, inviting our staff to complete these questionnaires again. And at this point, I guess we have had some difficulties with Our follow-up data, we have had a lower rate than anticipated at the 1 month follow-up. And of course, things have changed radically over the past year in terms of COVID-19 and the need to move to online training. And we anticipate that in the longer term, or at least in the medium term future, we will be offering this course online, whereas the data which we had gathered based on in-person training, but we have just about enough data to analyse, and we're hoping to do that very soon. But as Daniel mentioned, we're also in a phase of change with how we deliver both DBT and allied systems interventions in Ireland at the moment. So we're moving away from an external training model and towards a train the trainer model. So as part of our training plan, which we're really just in the very early stages of rolling out, we're explicitly including training programs for systems. So we're including family connections, of course, but we're also including Clinician Connections. So as a priority, as we're starting to roll out Clinician Connections nationally in Ireland, we're going to be continuing to gather data. So we're hoping that really within the next year, we will have significant data and we'll be able to answer those quantitative questions about whether Clinician Connections is effective for our clinicians or if we need to refine the program. So that brings me to the end of the presentation on Clinician Connections. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions which any of you may have.
Inne pytania? Chyba nie ma. A czemu mnie tu host spotlightuje?
The host has just spotlighted me. I don't know why. I suppose there are no questions, but let's wait for a few more minutes. But so far, I see no questions. But there's a comment in the chat box. It would be wonderful to implement a similar program in Poland. Let me ask a question. Mary, do you think that the program could be similar in terms of its development to Family Connections? So do you think it could be implemented in Poland as well? As Family Connections is implemented across the world, would you say that, well, what are the odds?
Absolutely. Hopefully over the next year, as I mentioned, we will have some quantitative data so that we will be able to say to you definitively, these are the outcomes for our clinicians, this is what we found. But I mean, I think there's every reason if we have some effective results, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be implemented in Poland. We're certainly happy to share all of our resources, and as you know, they're based on Family Connections. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic plan, and we'll be delighted to hear about you implementing that in Poland. And I know you too are interested in research, so I'm guessing that if you were in a position to gather data, you know, we'd have another opportunity to kind of check out if this is a helpful program or not.
O, to mam nadzieję, że tutaj też są obecni badacze z nami.
Brilliant. I do hope that researchers are present here with us, and maybe there are people who would be willing to join us. Maybe you could join our society and lend a helping hand in terms of research. So thank you, Mary. That's a good hint.
Yeah, and I see Daniel has just put a comment in the chat to say we can arrange this. Oh, no, sorry, that's in relation to sharing the findings, and when we have them, we can arrange to share them via NEA, which of course we will. So we'll ensure that we share them with you as soon as we have them.
No my będziemy trzymać rękę.
Okay, so we will be very interested in that, and perhaps another dream will come true, because these are wonderful programs. So thank you so much that you took out time to join this meeting, because you're showing us a lot of opportunities and development directions. With our limited resources, you know, our resources in Poland are quite limited in terms of psychiatric care. So we usually struggle with a lot of financial difficulties. So you're showing us a new perspective, because these programs are not necessarily very expensive. Clinician Connections, just like Family Connections, as I understand, is not a very expensive form of support. We're not talking about a one-year university course. So we can dedicate some time to create a program that really benefits a lot of people. So thank you for giving us some hope.
Thank you. That sounds fantastic. And we look forward to discussing that further with you.
Super. Dziękujemy teraz bardzo.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot, Mary. And I do hope that we will see you soon. Well, unfortunately, COVID made it impossible for us to meet in person. It's been a difficult time for all of us, for us too, to host this meeting, you know, to hold family connection sessions. We basically went online, so a very challenging time. But I do hope that once the pandemic is over, and we're keeping our fingers crossed here, we will have the opportunity to organize another meeting, another training with you. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time. And now I'd like to invite Anya Englert. Anya, where are you, my dear friend?
I'm just here. I would like to invite Dr. Liz Madza, because I've seen her somewhere and I just lost her. Yes, she's here.